Corrymeela Community as checked, and you. Thanks to everyone for coming today. We're here as part of a weekend-long event as part of Quiery, the Political Education Winter School, that we set up in 2022, essentially to bring activists from a range of community campaigns and movements together into one room and to strengthen those connections and how we can build a new society. When we did it in 2022, we had a day-long events of discussions in political education, and from internal feedback, we decided that we would shorten that for the next time. Somehow we've managed to expand it over 3 days this time, as it always happens with these sorts of festivals. Before I hand it over to the panel, I just want to say there's the barcode up here on the table for the full programme of events. We launched it last night. It was launched by a Palestinian called Khalid Al-Stal, who had a powerful conversation about how he got his kids from Gaza. And we watched John Pilger, the late John Pilger's film, Palestine is Still the Issue. His internationalism is central to this school as well. And tomorrow we have a day-long events of discussions starting from 12 p.m. with lunch, book launch, and we've got Claire Daly, Breed Smith and Chris Hazard speaking at 3 p.m. as the guest speakers tomorrow at 3 p.m. If you haven't registered yet, contact me by owen@glornamona.com, EOTHAN. And register space because it's running out, and we've only got this hall, as you can see. A lot of people will be coming for that. We'll finish the school then at firstly at 7:30 tomorrow. We'll have Mansour Adaifi come as the guest speaker of the school. Mansour is from Yemen and was detained and tortured for 14 years in Guantanamo Bay by the US. So we're so lucky to have him come over and talk to us. He'll be in conversation with Claire Daly, and followed by that, we'll have a concert for Palestine to raise money that will go directly to medical aid for Palestine. We've got a range of great singers and musicians playing tomorrow night, Fergus O'Hare and Grania Holland and a lot more. And there's also a barcode for that concert. You can donate, recommended £10, but any more or less is also welcome. And yeah, on the barcode there, and again, tickets are running out fast, so please get in contact if you can. I'm just going to hand it over to Sarah Boyce now. Is Gaelgore agus Quiery Pobble agus Carta Dana í Sarah atá na báil chomanta den acta spragal scriptor den slanta Iraq. Atá Quiery an cuairt a critical a cohu ar an curthaige tá an faoi láthair maidir leis an slanta Iraq agus maidir le súlacha ar winley leis máirtatha seachas an múnla ceanasach faoi láthair. Sarah is a Gaelgore and community and human rights activist, an organiser who is a committed member of the New Script for Mental Health campaign, which aims to foster critical conversations around the existing approach to mental health and to explore alternatives to the dominant medical model. So, Corrymeela, Sarah.
From better sitting or standing. Just just I live like and show and you. Really delighted to see all of you here today. And New Script for Mental Health. We're partnered with Glornamona for a new series of conversations called Curious Minds Will Find a Way as part of the New Script movement. And this is the second one today, the second of the conversation series. We had Dr. Pat Bracken, a critical psychiatrist, up at the end of last year, and that was our first one. So we're really delighted to be able to do this as part of the Skol Gevru Ukaijin here today. So thanks to everybody for coming along. I know everybody's busy these days, but it's just great to see that we can come together to have these conversations, which are so important. I'll just give you a bit of an idea of how the next hour or so is going to run, and then I'm going to introduce the speakers. I suppose the other thing to say is, and Owen touched on it already, the conversations that we're having here today and beyond, these are conversations that are happening all over the world now, thankfully. There's been a shift away from the very individualised and medicalised approach to mental health to starting to think differently. And it's so important, how we talk and how we think really shapes our consciousness about anything. So in relation to mental health, the World Health Organization and the UN have led the way, I suppose, and there is a need globally for a different approach to mental health, not the individualised medical one, which is kind of looked at now as the frozen status quo, but something that is around understanding how trauma is really underneath so much of what happens, people's experiences in their lives that drives, mental distress and despair. So that's really, in terms of our thinking, where we're trying to go in our conversations as well, but also then how we respond to it. And the New Script for Mental Health is doing a number of things. There's a lot of activists here today from the campaign, which is brilliant. We're a human rights organisation and campaign, so we're holding the state to account for its failures, and the failures are, at times catastrophic in terms of deaths, loss of life, serious harm being caused to individuals and families. So that's one side of the campaign. The other side of the campaign is, we can't just wait for the state to fix things because the model is wrong. So we're looking at, all of us have ideas and wisdom here. So how do we talk and think about what would be a better approach to mental health, looking at community-based alternatives, ways of healing together, and we know the value and critical importance of collective and solidarity and all of that. So that's really at the heart of the campaign. So just in terms of the running order, I'll introduce the speakers, and we're delighted to have this fabulous lineup of speakers with us today. And each of them will give their thoughts and reflections on the topic. So the theme is from stigma and silence to storytelling and solidarity. And then we're going to open it up so that all of us here can have a conversation around that and see what thoughts you have as you're listening. So we really want to hear from yourselves as well and have that conversation. Did Owen do the housekeeping? I don't know where's Owen. Just if there's a fire alarm, just to mention, this exit here as you come in, down the stairs and left, right into Nansen Street. So just if you had to assemble, and the toilets are out to the right when you go out the door there. We'll aim to wrap up around 2:15, but we're not in a big hurry to get out of here. But just also be aware, if you need to leave, that's if you need to go for whatever reason. The other thing we'd like people to take on and keep in mind is, obviously with the theme that we're talking about today, it may bring up things for you, it may not, but it may bring up, we're talking about trauma, we're talking about people's experiences in mental health services. We won't be going into anything in any great depth, but none of us know, what kind of sometimes triggers things, so just be aware of that. If you need to take some time, even to go out and come back in, get a glass of water, just do what you need to do. And we're also here. We have some information on the table outside around support services. And just also after today, sometimes it's when you go home tonight or the next day, things can kind of come into your head or you feel things. So just we encourage people to be aware of that as well. So I'm going to move on to introduce the speakers. Denise Bradley. So Denise's story has 25 years of leadership training and a practitioner experience in community and statutory sectors, working with trauma and healing within marginalised populations, including survivors of violence and abuse, gender inequality, displacement, conflict and social injustice. Denise works with the Corrymeela Community, and she also works as a freelance trauma-informed practitioner, trainer and facilitator. She's done her master's in gender, conflict and human rights, and she's not decided, no, that wasn't enough. She's continuing with her study. She's doing a postgrad scholarship with Bessel Van Der Kolk, which some of you may have heard of, at the Trauma Research Foundation in the USA. And Denise is a passionate advocate for developing rights-based trauma-informed peace building and social justice methodologies, both here in the north of Ireland and beyond. And outside of all that, Denise, or connected to it, probably Denise loves to nurture her growing family, dance, silversmith and swimming in the cold water, the cold sea. And Mary Quiery, who I know a lot of you in the room already know, Mary's a practicing Gestalt therapist. She's been an activist in and worked with the LGBTQ+ community for over 30 years. And Mary has a particular interest in the impact of inequality on our mental health, including her own. And I'd just like to add that, we owe a lot to Mary for obviously Mary's activism and support and solidarity over all these decades. But the genesis of this New Script for Mental Health campaign is partly, conversations that we were having with Mary all along in the last 6 years or more. In the campaign, activists were saying, we're trying to fix this system. Every time we go to power, you know, they nod their head or they pat us on the head and then nothing changes. You try to fix waiting times, you try to make an improvement over here, more funding for counselling, and as soon as you take your eye off that, it's back to the same old, same old. And yet we just felt there's something just not, we're not joining up the dots here. And Mari, just those conversations really helped us with our thinking around the bigger picture, around the overall approach to mental health and sort of the narrative around it, and seeing that we needed to lift our own sights and vision to look at that, and also then the absolute critical importance of the collective and coming together, that so much of treatment and is done to the individual and very disempowering often. And I think that really, just to say, Mari, that really helped us all. I think those conversations and broadening our own understanding as well. So, Corrymeela. And lastly, not leastly, Lisa Morrison. So Lisa's story is Lisa entered psychiatric services at the age of 14 and has had multiple diagnoses imposed on her. And realising that trauma was at the heart of her symptoms, she fought to finally get complex trauma recognised in 2020. Lisa now runs her own training and consultancy business, teaching about the impact of trauma and the value and importance of trauma-informed value and principles for people needing, and also those working across a range of services. And luckily for us, Lisa also works with us part-time on the new Script for Mental Health campaign, calling for a better, a kinder, a rights-based approach to and the understanding of mental health issues. So you can see that, you know, the amount of wisdom and knowledge collectively and experience that the panel has, but also we know that's in this room here in front of us. So I hope we have a really productive conversation here this afternoon. So I'm going to ask Denise maybe to start us. And if we can use the mics, it would be helpful just for the recording. This is being recorded, but the audience isn't being recorded, isn't that right, Marty? Just the panel, just in case anybody. The photos of the panel. Is that okay with anybody? Anybody not okay with that? It's all right if we have photos of the group? Okay, great. So thank you, Denise.
So thank you, Sarah, and thank you for inviting me into this incredible gathering of people today. I suppose as I've been reflecting sort of over the last week about my thoughts, particularly in terms of trauma, I suppose I'm really drawn to the sharp rise that I have noticed over the last 25 years of my experience, and that's both professional and my own personal experiences of trauma. The sharp rise really around trauma and how it's suddenly just everywhere we look, we see trauma. We see trauma in social media. We're seeing trauma, I suppose, informed practices. And I suppose that's good in some respects, but also I think I'm curious that we risk reducing actually what is trauma and what is trauma-informed. And I suppose maybe to think about that, I need to probably talk a little bit about what my experience of trauma is in terms of my work. So when we think of trauma, its origins is in the Greek word for wound or tearing. And we think of psychological trauma, that is the deep tearing, the deep wounding of our whole being, often fragmented. And I suppose when a person, a group, a community are presented with an overwhelming terror, or it could be multiple events, or it could be an accumulation of chronic stress. It's often outside of their realms of their normal protective functioning. And as a result, that causes a deep tearing, a deep wounding of our nervous systems. So that brutally forces apart our psyche, our mind, and our soma, our body. And that's where the wounding happens. And if that's not tended to, if it's not processed, then that's whenever we start to see issues happening for people. It disconnects us from our bodies, and it often disconnects us from our social supports. And I know even thinking about, whenever we think about trauma, it's really helpful to think about wounds because often they're not visible. And those wounds can become infected. They can become infected because usually the nature of trauma is because of power and control. It's usually something that has been done to us, and it can be through gender-based violence, it can be through war, conflict, but it leaves us feeling as if something is wrong with us, as if we have done something wrong. I'm not good enough. It's down to me. And there's where those wounds become infected, and often that's when you see shame, you can see unprocessed grief, loss, trying to manage chronic fear symptoms, and actually that gets locked into the body. It's not in the mind, it's in our bodies, and that's what Bessel Van Der Kolk would say, the body keeps the score, which has been so useful for me over the years, particularly working with people, because they often don't know what's happening. They haven't had time to process the events, the experiences. And I suppose really, when we think of those root causes, that was why trauma-informed care was really developed. It was birthed about 40 years ago. It wasn't birthed by psychiatry. It was birthed by a group of people gathered here, like that we're gathered here today. And I suppose they had had their own experience of traumas. It was maybe psychiatrists, social workers, nurses, advocates, activists, who had all been through really painful and difficult experiences. And they started to listen to their clients who were sitting silent, who were being stigmatized by so many institutions. And because they got better at listening, because they had their own experience, they started to hear stories that were really quite horrible. And what they started to do was start asking, what is happening for you, as opposed to what is wrong with you, but also what is happening within you as a lack of having compassionate witness or people to connect with. And that really changed the shape, I suppose, of the care and the care that they were given. But I suppose because we know that trauma comes to us all, sooner or later, the world breaks all of us in some way. We had to they also had to then start thinking about what are the root causes of trauma. And that is in so many areas of our world. And again, I've mentioned a couple of them, whether it's through war, conflict, abuse, and particularly institutional abuse and systemic abuse of power. There's a real vacuum for me at the moment, particularly here in Northern Ireland, of trauma-informed care is still maybe solely medicalising. It's still socially prescribing. It's still checklisting adverse child experiences. And there's a real gap, a real vacuum for institutional systemic accountability. And we need to really start thinking about that vacuum. Why is there that lack of accountability? So I suppose when we think of the stigma and silence that trauma can create because of its very nature, but then whenever we do get better at holding compassionate spaces, gatherings, where we can start to share story of truth and speak truth to power, we realise it's a collective experience. And we really need to think about that solidarity. And I think that's my big reflection is the better that we can become on standing together, sitting together, moving together, trauma-informed does need that social movement to propel forward. Because people also need their stories validated. They need accountability. They need reparation. And that's the bit that we're really stuck with. So when, I suppose my kind of reflection is be curious about those vacuums, about what's not being said in terms of holding the root causes of trauma to account.
Yeah, thank you so much, Denise. There was just so much in that already, and so much I think that will resonate with people in the room. So, Mara, if I invite you now, I'll give you this mic.
Thank you, Sarah. I've always said to people that the best way to handle your anxiety is to admit it. And I've said to at least 3 people in here, I'm really nervous about doing this. And each person said to me, not at all, Mary, that's not you, kind of thing. So I'm fessing up to feeling quite nervous about this. And some of it is because I'm aware I'm in a space with a lot of activists who have, at some expense to their own physical and emotional health, have taken stands against inequality in this society. So I'd like to pay tribute to that. Also in her introduction, Sarah didn't mention that I'm a lapsed sea swimmer. For the first time, I gave up
Accepting lapse.
this December and January. I just thought I couldn't cope with it. So, so anyway, what I'd like to address is that the title is the stigma that is attached to trauma and the events that create trauma, and how that plays into a power imbalance and inequality in our society in a way which, as Denise mentions, leaves us to blame ourselves. My background originally was in community-based adult education, and I was talking to Eileen Weir about is that I remember going back year after year to the Shankill Women's Centre and looking at the same women who weren't progressing on, and it eventually dawned on me that they all had experienced really severe trauma as kids. And so I retrained as a therapist, and I've worked with both organisations and individuals and groups around addressing not only people's individual but also their community-based experience of trauma and the origins of that. So I noticed as I was preparing for this that how angry I still feel about all of this, because secrecy and silence are the perpetrator's first line of defence. And so many of us suffered that. And when I say perpetrators, I include the state in that as well. So it's a form of isolating us with our own individual experience and taking some of the blame on ourselves. And I suppose I'm just going to highlight 2 sort of areas where that has had an enormous impact. Is the power, or how disempowering that silence and stigma is. And I suppose I'm looking particularly at violence against girls and women, and also the impact of homophobia. As Sarah said, I've worked a lot. I'm lesbian myself, and faced a lot of the stigmatization that there was when I came out in 1978. I was only 5 at the time, I should say that. But, so violence against women is hidden, still hidden, even though we still don't have a policy in the North around violence against women and girls. I see it as part of patriarchy. It's part of a power imbalance, and that silence actually stops young women in particular, and women in general, reaching out for support and taking the blame on themselves, and working with women who are in refuges in Belfast and the greater Belfast area. The one thing they all have in common was that they question themselves. How come this was me, this happened to, and it didn't happen to, my neighbour or my sister or whatever. And so that, as Denise mentions, the shame that goes with that is very disempowering and leads to a lot of isolation. And the one thing that that actually stops women accessing support or leaving a situation of abuse is because of that, because of the shame that they carry around, feeling their own responsibility for it. I can't, begin to go into enough depth about the impact that homophobia has had on the mental health of our communities. And it's not that long ago since we were called an abomination. You know, there's still the term gay and queer is still used as a term of abuse in the classroom, and not just by the kids, but by teachers as well. There's very little training around the impact of that, or what homophobia is. The young trans people are facing, horrendous discrimination and abuse, and it's the highest level of deaths through violent crime is experienced by trans people, and I suppose that again there was a silence to that it was tolerated. People kept, as the term would have been used, closeted. And again, there was some shame to attach to that rather than being out in pride. Now, I know that has shifted, but it's still very difficult for young people. They go through, on average, a period of about 8 years where they have some awareness, which I had of just being different, but couldn't actually put a name to it when I was 9. But to carry that right through your adolescence. And as you will know, one of the most important pieces of adolescence is when you leave whatever your family background has been, whether that was dysfunctional or not, but you separate out and you start to identify more with your peers. And that is still not available to a large number of our queer young people. They don't have access to, when they're 12, of running up an entry, snogging somebody, then running away and never seeing them again. That their adolescence is very limited in terms of their sexuality, and they get very used to turning that energy inwards and, coping with, their own trauma. Now, people survive that level of trauma. What they can't do is when they hit something else in life, like unemployment, homelessness, the loss of a relative through violent crime. That's when they actually, when they discover suddenly that they need access to some form of support. And unfortunately, in our culture, what is generally on offer is medication. And, as Denise said, it's very individualized. So the most powerful stigma, there is stigma in general, but the most powerful stigma is that we carry within ourselves. And that's the most poisonous piece, is actually blaming ourselves, saying, well, could I have handled that better? Could I have been nicer? Whatever, have I brought some of this onto myself? And I suppose the reason that I'm here is because I have a lot of respect for New Script that offers a human rights-based approach and puts the blame where it belongs. This is a rights issue. We are entitled to have good health. And in fact, the research over the past 15 years have shown us that there is not a distinction between the mind and the body. They are the one thing, the same and one. And that whereas it's easier to talk about physical health, and even that, some people carry shame around that as well. But in terms of mental health, it's still considered something to be shameful about. So I don't want to go on for too long, but the New Script supports activism. And activism is, I have discovered over the last 30 years, is one of the most effective ways to tackle our mental health and our self-esteem, is to go out and make a difference. And I know that, I'm talking to people who are all doing this, but we do need support, and New Script offers that. So I just want to quote the person who I first read, who wrote about trauma, was a woman called Judith Herman, who wrote a book which I'd still highly recommend, linking, a trauma with violence against women. But she says this, which I'd like to finish with: advances in the field of trauma occur only when they are supported by a political movement powerful enough to legitimate an alliance between investigators and patients, and to counteract the ordinary social processes of silencing and denial. In the absence of strong political movements for human rights, the active process of bearing witness inevitably gives way to the active process of forgetting. Repression, disassociation, and denial are phenomena of social as well as individual consciousness. So long may New Script thrive and supporting that level of activism and pushing mental health higher up the political agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Again, there's just so much in that. I think just really when we open up I think you've prompted so many thoughts, certainly for me. And just before I hand to Lisa, I think what you were saying at the start around the silencing by the state, I think that's one of the key things for us. And Denise, you were talking about it as well. It's making the invisible visible, because the norm and the dominant, I suppose, narrative or story we're being told around mental health is the individual medical chemical imbalance, which obviously has been completely debunked. But if nobody kind of surfaces that and said, this is one story, this is one way of looking at mental health that we've been told, and the power that's come with that. But if the best thing we can do really is to kind of shine a light on all of that and say there's a better way of kind of understanding what's going on and why people are experiencing distress, what both of you were saying. But it's so important here because I think it's even more insidious here, the silencing by the state. The campaigners some of them have spent 15 years trying to get changes in mental health, and it's very insidious and very subtle, but the silencing and the shutting down and the blaming and the further sort of stigmatization and reinforcing when people try to kind of open up and even question anything. So I think it's so important people coming together to say, this is something we need to talk about. And there is a power hierarchy here, like Judith Herman was saying. And we're trying to take away that power thing that everybody, whether you're working in mental health services or you've access services, it's harming everybody. The current system, there's no doubt it's harming everybody. So for us, we want to work across with people working in mental health services who are saying this needs to be changed, this isn't working. So I'll hand over to Lisa now.
Hi. I'm much more comfortable. I'm also very nervous. And to be honest, I'm much more comfortable if I'm training, because that feels a bit more like I'm in control, because I'm just going to share with you my experience, I suppose, taking it down just to say as well that this is my truth. It's a truth, not the truth. And I think that's one of the most powerful things, is being able to take back our story, to own who we are, when trauma so often removes that. So just a very brief, I was 14 when I sat in front of a psychiatrist, and I still actually have the notes because I've got dreadful memory loss, and was diagnosed with major depression, and the notes say significant anhedonia. So I had to look that up. So often language as well is used to exclude and stigmatize. And that didn't take any pleasure in life. And I guess looking back on that, I'm quite sad that at the age of 14, I was taking no pleasure in life and wanting to die, and made my first suicide attempt at the age of 16. At the age of 19, I ended up in one of those, and I'm just actually going to illustrate from then to now, because I can't tell you about, that was 14, I just turned 50 last year. So, but I'm going to use this as an illustration. I was in an old institution, psychiatric institution. I don't know how long I was there for, but part of that time I was in a lockup ward. And one of the things I very clearly remember is being in a concrete cell in seclusion overnight, because I kept trying to die. And I remember that cell, and I remember when we talk about traumas held in the body, I remember the cold floor, I remember the lack of dignity of having been stripped, and I remember the little window at the top and just this closed door and no toilet, and thinking, what if I need to go to the toilet? Just basic dignity. And then fast forward to 2009, when I relapsed of my eating disorder. By this time in my life, 2009, I'd moved here. My husband was from here, moved here in 2000. But I had accumulated quite a number of diagnoses. So just to give you a bit of an overview of that, it was schizoid affective personality disorder, schizoid personality disorder, major depression with psychotic features, bipolar, anorexia, bulimia, emotionally unstable personality disorder, and bipolar disorder. So I'm very disordered. I was very disordered, let's just say. And I went into Bluestone, which was at the time then, I think it had only been opened about a year, perhaps, a new, brand spanking new psychiatric unit, which I spent 8 years going in and out of. And during that time, I lost my job, I lost my marriage. I lost any last semblance of hope, if I'm honest. Certainly was a lost cause, and in 2016 was told that they would need to find supported living for me. And you know, in this brand spanking new psychiatric unit, was really no different to that cold concrete cell. The staff and the most were kind, and I've got my notes because I've got such dreadful memory loss from all the electroshock that I needed those because those were part of my story that I didn't remember. And staff and the most were kind and cared, but it was a cold concrete cell where I lost hope, where I didn't believe recovery was possible, where I kept acting out in dreadful self-harm, suicide attempts. I was a very bold girl, actually. I set fire once and set the alarm off. I was trying to, now I know that's quite serious, but my husband and I do have a giggle about it now. You know, I was mad, right? But these things we do, the self-harm, the overeating, the vomiting, too much sex, too much online, too much this, too much that. What I've learned is these things were helping soothe because of so much trauma in my life. And I don't want to talk about that today, but it's there, and I don't need to tell you what happened to me in order for my experiences to be validated, because that's what I own, and those are the choices I make, because it's about that powerlessness. It's about being a nobody and an invisible when that trauma is inflicted. And in those years, I was seen through a diagnosis, and I was medicated. I was on medication from the age of 14 till that. And I'm not anti-meds, and I'm not anti-psychiatry, but I am pro-rights, and I'm pro-knowing, and I'm pro-choices, because the thing that trauma does is it removes choices, and it makes you believe that you're wrong and you're bad and you asked for this. And trying to make yourself enough, you fill yourself with all sorts of things. But really, what was going on? You know, what is going on for people? And yet we medicalize, we pathologize, and we go into systems that are clinical and cold when what we know about trauma is how it's responded to, how it's held, how it's heard, how it's believed. All impacts our recovery. We know that that happens in relationship. We're harmed in relationship. Therefore, we need to heal in relationship. And that's pretty hard when you've been let down time and time again. And childhood trauma specifically, our nervous system becomes wired for protection. Here I am, and it's a long story how I got out of that, but I spent 6 months in a treatment center in South Africa. When I went there, I was on 2 antipsychotics, 4 tranquilizers, a sleeping tablet, and an antidepressant. One day I'm going to go and get Jane to do a fabulous art thing with all the medications I've been on over the years. And I had 6 courses of ECT, electroshock therapy, over 7 years, 6 courses of ECT. it's not okay to shock women's brains. 70% of people who get ECT are women. It's not okay to shock your brain because you've had violence inflicted on you in a system that didn't protect or respond as it should have to what happened. It was a whole series of events and people and circumstances that I'm sitting here today so grateful for my life and grateful for so many people here. My manager at the Recovery College, when I worked there, when I came back from treatment and was starting to build my life from scratch, she gave me space to be, to grow my wings. I had to leave the system because the system, working in the system, these challenges that people come up about, you're told you're inspirational and you're told you're great, but nothing changes. And you're silenced and you feel there's something wrong with you again and you're being difficult. Repeat offender, revolving door. Psychosis, we don't talk about that either. A lot of people who have experienced trauma have psychosis voices. Researchers care about that. I see Sarah looking at her watch. I went a bit off track there, sorry. Sorry, got it on my thing about ECT. But it's a violence against women when you've experienced so much violence. And I guess the medication was a silencing. And I choose now to have a low dose because of the overwhelm. There's so much system trauma, institutional, religious trauma we don't talk about as well. Messes with your head. New script. I then went out, started my own business so that I could choose. And that was a privilege. I did that because I was privileged and I had the economic stability to do that. You know, people, we talk about the 5 steps to well-being. Have you been on antipsychotics? Have you been living without having food on your table for your children? And they're coming along and telling you need to eat better and walk every day. And you're isolated and, you know, anti-stigma campaigns, they don't talk about people like me who repeat to ED department 27 times and hear voices and see visions. No more stigma or shame. New script is about writing a new way forward. It's not about just discarding everything that's there because there's a place for everything and there's a place for everybody. And what I saw when I worked in services is staff were equally silenced. Staff equally didn't have a voice. My heart is for all of us. It's for humanity. I don't want to be defined by the girl in recovery. A new script is saying, let's come together, let's be curious, let's have brave conversations. Let's challenge the root causes, the injustices, the inequalities, the political, the individualization, because we need each other in this. We need each other to heal and move forward. And I'm just going to finish with this last piece about hope. And Siobhan over there, who's one of the activists, reposted the tweet about today. And what she said is, and our very own Lisa. And I'm a blow-in here. And I think that captures for me the feeling of being in the new script, just being me, that we all come as we are. You don't have to fit a box. And although we're different in many ways, we all want better for all of us, you know, and that's what drives and pulls us together. And that's the hope on days when I lose it. That's the hope when I come back together with people and say, we can do this. There is a better way. And we need all of us with our gifts and skills and what we bring. So thank you so much for having me. And thank you to Sarah and to all my buddies out there. Yeah, you're amazing.
Thank you, Lisa. That was so powerful, and thank you for sharing that with us as well. And thanks to Denise and Mary. I think there's just so much in what Mary, Denise, and Lisa have shared with us. So we would just take a wee minute. And I know you'll have had thoughts listening to the 3 speakers. And you know, the title is from Stigma and Silence, which we've heard so powerfully about how, at a very personal cost and level as well, Lisa, in terms of you sharing just your story over the years, how it's impacted on you and your fight to regain yourself, but also, you know, what Mary and Denise were saying as well around how trauma, where it comes from, how it affects us in our body as well, and that it is held in the body. And Mary was talking about what we can do and the power, all three of you were talking about the power of the collective, because if we try to move, what we're trying to do is move from stigma and silence to storytelling and the absolute power of and the truth, as you were saying, Lisa, about people's stories and people's truth, but coming and to being heard. You know, that's part of a new script, just people sharing their own story without any judgment or any commentary, or could it just actually somebody listening and being heard and seen. But maybe we just kind of get to hear from yourself what thoughts, what reflections you have, you know, and what you've heard. Yeah, and then we'll maybe try and think about, we're all here together today and we know that we want to change things. That's why we've come along today. So even today and beyond today, what can we do in terms of the collective? There's a lot of power in this room, so it would be great to take some time to talk about that as well. So if we start with Letitia.
Just a question.
Can everybody hear okay?
If you've been in the mental health system, how can you get access to your notes?
Lisa?
That's just through a freedom of information.
Okay. Thank you.
And if it's helpful, we're going to put something up on our website, and everybody should have a leaflet there, New Script for Mental Health. So we'll put something on it about how you a template to make it as easy to go and get a freedom of information, so that we'll get that up now fairly shortly. We're going to put little bite-sized pieces of information over the next few months on how you do certain things. How do you make a complaint? How do you get your file? If there's a serious adverse incident review, how do you make sure that actually works? What are your rights if you're detained? All of these things that people don't even have the information on, and that isn't being provided anywhere. So that's the plan over the next few months, to start to build up and share that information to empower people. Anybody else? Anne, and then who's over here? Yeah, great. Anne.
I have a question for Denise. I was interested in that comment about trauma-informed approaches and working as a psychologist within statutory services. I'm interested in your thoughts about little things that can be done to address a situation where nowadays statutory services will talk about transgenerational trauma, and they'll use that to argue for more of the same, more individualised psychotherapy, more medication. And I came across like a podcast by a medical historian called Ian Miller from the University of Ulster, and he had written about how during the 70s and 80s in Northern Ireland, psychiatrists, psychologists, the public health authority, might be a different term then, argued and provided reports saying that there was no impact on communities in the 70s and 80s, and his analysis was there was a distinct stance of silencing and neutrality that wasn't really a neutrality, and this wasn't coming from politics, this was coming from the research community, this was coming from psychologists, this was coming from medical professionals. Have you any ideas or suggestions on where we can start with that false naming of transgenerational trauma?
It's a huge area. A wonderful reflection and wonderful question. I mean, really, when we think about trauma-informed care and how even at the moment that it's being presented from, I think, Safeguarding Board and how it's, I suppose, trying to be filtered in, my belief is that they have no choice but actually to try and bring something in. And something, a diluted form is better than nothing. And it's my understanding that they're taking their framework at the moment from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service in America, which isn't even contextual to our country. It's not contextual to our conflict, to our pain and suffering. So even that in itself needs to be addressed from the outset. I think also trauma-informed services and supports is about lived experience. It's a participant, it's a person-centered approach, just what Lisa and both Marie were talking about. It needs to be co-created with people who are using the services. And what we're seeing is still this very top-down ownership. Honestly, personally, and this is my personal view, is that psychiatry do not want it. They would prefer that they can't. But actually, because of the field of traumatology, which is separate, the traumatic stress is separate from psychiatry. And it's only that they have been researching and pushing trauma to keep it active. Because as Judith Herman said, you know, even the study of psychological trauma over the years has these active periods of interest followed by periods of episodic amnesia. So as soon as they get the information and try and get treatment to treat or cure people per se, as soon as the root causes, as soon as the harms that are being caused start to be brought into visibility, there's a silencing. And I think that's what we're seeing. I think we're seeing an intentional silencing. And I think there really is a very, I'm trying to think of the word, but again, I was saying to the girls, I'm actually going through menopause, so word finding, probably too much information, but I'm struggling with my mental recall. But I think what we're seeing is a selective use of research. And it's not trauma-informed. I have been studying this for years, practicing, you're never fully trauma-informed. I think, you know, Caroline, you know, we were talking about that up at Corrymeela a couple of days ago. It has to be led by the people. Yes, we can provide a framework around our services, the supports, but it's the people who inform. I don't know if that's helpful, if that even answers your question, but it's just some reflections.
I just want to add to that about systems, because I've been in them, I've worked in them, and then went outside. And I think there's such deeply entrenched hierarchies and power differentials across all practices or professions, and a whole new way. We need a new way. This is what we're doing, and that's the same outside, socially, politically. You know, there's those power structures, and I think that's what this is about, coming together on a level, bringing our different gifts and skills.
Yes, it's first of all, just naming transgenerational trauma is important, and that the victims and survivors group, they decided very early on that it didn't exist, and now they've had to shift on that because they've been put under pressure from activists and campaigners. So that, you know, the actual naming of it. Plus, I don't think that we fully know or are aware of the impact that the pharmaceutical industry has globally in terms of that. You can see it's in terms of the economy, particularly in the south of Ireland, who, as far as I'm concerned, are in hock to global capitalism. But, you know, so that is something that's totally separate from mental health. And I agree with Denise that there needs to be democratization, there needs to be some form of accountability. Psychiatrists that I know, and occasionally I would get a referral from them, they don't have any supervision, whereas all of us do, of someone who is independent and who is giving you an opportunity to reflect on your practice. So it is a form of medical care that involves a lot of stigmatization, and that relies on people being isolated and taken out as individuals.
Is it Noelle? Yeah, Noelle. You want the mic or?
Sarah, I just want to thank you on behalf of all of us. I'm here with some of our
our board from the Northern Ireland Mental Health Arts Festival, Frank Liddy, who all of you will know, and Bruno Lawson. And a number of us are coming from a context of lived experience in terms of mental health and well-being, but also the whole idea of ending the stigma, or certainly in terms of talking about it. And I just can't, on a personal level, you know, like many families, we've been through some of the experiences, Lisa, that you have talked about, and in the context that you've talked about as well. And it's heartbreaking. It's absolutely heartbreaking. But what is really powerful is the fact of, at the point that you've all been making, is the power of the collective voice and the power of channeling that lived experience into something that's really, really important. And I think this idea of anaesthetising us, you know, in all sorts of ways, metaphorically speaking, is something that I think we've felt for some time. I think you mentioned the institutional accountability, and the lack of it is something that we really do have to challenge. And I suppose the power of being curious and creative is that we have the power to think outside, and often the skills with, you know, creative and curious thinking to come up with new solutions. So I just want to praise you and acknowledge the importance of what you're doing, and anything that we can do to help support you regionalising this message. Because I live in County Fermanagh, but from County Armagh, know Craigavon Hospital very, very well, sadly, and the context, whether it's rural or urban, the voices have been silenced. The challenges are there, and it's interesting that, you know, in terms of male and female mental health, I'm reminded on a daily basis that women, you know, express themselves more easily than men. So it is something that we have to address, and I'm so delighted I'm here today. Thank you.
Yeah.
Neela, thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing that feedback. And I guess just to say, you know, as I was listening to you there's two things that you were saying that are anaesthetising, and the pharmaceutical industry has a lot to account for in terms of things, and that individualising and then coming back collectively too is just so important. And there is another way. You know, there are other ways. And I forgot actually there was something in what you said, and I've actually forgotten it. So I'm just admitting that, okay? And when I remember it, I will come back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Yeah, I think we're all on the same tack here with the memory loss. Just to also, I'll come to you now. But just thank you, Noelle, and it's great to have people yourselves here from the Northern Ireland Mental Health Festival. Yeah, a new script. I mean, that's probably one of the most powerful things for us. We were rehearsing last night with Damien Gorman, the playwright. We're working on a Desperate Monologues that's going to have its first outing next Thursday on St. Bridget's Day. And hopefully we'll be able to connect with yourselves and maybe perform it later in the spring. But yeah, creativity definitely for us has been the way in terms of coming together and healing. Lady down the back.
Yes,
give you a mic.
Thank you all. Thank you, Lisa, for your personal experience. And let us question to Elizabeth, whoever can answer. Talking about self-harm and talking about psychosis with depression with psychotic symptoms, and talking about suicidal ideations and active plans. What do you think, or anybody else thinks, what else can work? What are the alternatives? What options do we have when actually somebody is acutely unwell, we'll say, with self-harm, that they're very strong, or suicidal ideation? What do you think, or anybody else thinks that we can do?
Thank you so much for your question. You know, it's complex because I still need to use mental health services, right? So I went out of them, and I fought for a diagnosis. I was never diagnosed with trauma, you know, with all my diagnoses, despite my significant history. And I was eventually diagnosed with complex trauma and dissociation, and started working with an EMDR therapist who is a psychiatrist as well. And that opened my mind to a whole different way of understanding. There's also the Hearing Voices movement. I self-harmed it was very problematic. And it was I talk about the 100 stories on my skin. It wasn't understood. Dissociation, which happens when you're traumatized, you can leave your body, The research is now evidencing that a lot of people with voices who have more voices, and voices of children as well. You know, I live with voices. It's quite a lot of work, I can tell you, to get myself up to something like this and organize everybody. But it's a different understanding of it, and services have accommodated that with me. So when something is happening, the self-harm was an expression of many things. So it was having my story heard and validated, first of all. It was also being helped to learn how to just regulate and soothe from the distress, the flashbacks, the body holds. You literally can feel things that have happened to you in your body. And that was never addressed. So I think there's a lack of understanding and a lack of compassionate and longer-term therapy specialized for that. Through that, my self-harm, it's been a long while now, well, a long enough while that I haven't self-harmed relative to what it was like, because I've used my body, I've been taught to connect in. You're not taught to think about your body, where you hold things, to express how that feels. And there's not compassionate spaces to be in. There's not time for that relational thing when you're working with staff in a system. As much as you want to, there's not that relational space. But then there's a lot of people who heal through peer support. The Hearing Voices movement is one of those. So it's very difficult when services are so deeply entrenched in the patriarchy, in psychiatry, in a way of doing things. But I think within that, if there are teams that bring in new ways, if there's understanding, and my therapist would talk very much about the dissociation, the voices, and the self-harm. And in fact, your man Bruce Perry talks about that. He's done a lot of research with children's trauma, using self-harm to regulate, because it does that. You have all that extra cortisol or whatever, and it helps you calm down. So it just becomes like, and you've got to do it worse and worse. I don't know if that answers a bit. It's changing a whole mindset. You see, there's not spaces. You see, there's not options and choices for somebody who's acutely psychotic to have anything other than medical treatment where, and I'm not saying that medication, I'm not against, some people find it very helpful, but we don't have centers where people can go in that state to find their way through that is not clinical. Yes. It's all managing risk. Correct, and that's the culture. So staff are afraid, they don't feel they'll be supported. That's why it's such a big area. But you still can do that. You see, I've worked with staff who still can be compassionate, can, with that knowledge, can do that. So there is always things that people can do, whatever situation you work in.
So there's not a straightforward answer to your question, but I do notice that in terms of suicide and mental health overall, there's very strong research has shown that there's a very strong link to inequality in society. Societies where there's an enormous gap between those who have and those who haven't, which and poverty has increased enormously in our society, there is a much higher risk of poor mental health. Interestingly, not just for the people who are experiencing the oppression of not having an income, but everybody. And it's one incentive that to the wealthy is to say your mental health will suffer as well as the poor. You know, so poverty and class is an enormous, that's the most at-risk group in terms of mental health, and the group that I'm most experienced with, which has the highest level of suicide in the north, would be the LGBT community. And so what is needed there is for schools to start addressing at an early age. I think you were asking about what can you do in an institution. Well, the first thing, is to have a rainbow flag just up on the wall. You're showing that you're open. Now, schools are very resistant to that here. It starts at a very young age. We need to be, I think that the transfer test has enormous to answer for in terms of the focus it puts on our education system, where we should be encouraging children to open out, to start to enjoy expressing themselves and reading. We've got them all focused on doing a test that is not a measure of anything. So there's a whole variety of ways, but until, and I do, I'm not saying that the psychiatric profession are opposed to that. I know that there's a lot of very caring people, but it would be useful if the profession spoke out a bit more, because we are hitting a mental health crisis. There is no indication that it's going to get any better.
Thank you, Mary. Eileen, and any other? Eileen, Barry, and Mags. Okay, and then maybe we want to move the question on just for the time we have left around what we can all do here when we are here together. So Eileen first, and Barry, and then Mags.
I really don't know where to start. I'm a frustrated activist when it comes to mental health. I was part of 2006 first Protect Life strategy, and accountability by the trust, by the agencies, didn't come. Community and community organisations have took the heavy load here, and still are taking the heavy load. They produced Protect Life strategy number 2, which was 4 years out of date. It was done 4 years prior, and because it had nothing to do on International Suicide Awareness Day, they put out a strategy that was 4 years overdue, and things had changed in 4 years within communities. I'm into the job of prevention, hopefully, and I think, as Maury says and a lot of the other ones, if we don't start taking this into our schools, into our education system, into our colleges that are training nurses and doctors, because at our first life strategy and our second, doctors got a half a day on mental health training as part of their qualifications to come out. So I'm in the job of prevention because it's getting worse, and if we don't start, we need to start in all sectors. I was lucky enough, and it's not about me, but I was lucky enough to go to America when I worked in the suicide field. And we went to America, and it was the first time I heard trauma mentioned in 2007, because it was a bad word here in Northern Ireland. It was mental health, mental health, mental health. And in America, all the agencies is around the one table. And I think that's a place to start, to try and cure the issues that we have, but we need to start for prevention as well as trying to actually work with those who have went through a series of trauma and mental health illnesses over the years. You don't understand that we're 55 years, 30 years of a conflict, so there's some. And I think we missed out big time in the Good Friday Agreement of having a specialised mental health service here in Northern Ireland, when Manchester has more services in Manchester than what we have in this whole island for mental health services. So accountability, prevention, education in schools, and if you need help, will volunteer at anything to do with mental health. Unfortunately, a lot of the workers out there, it's not only the mental health services within the communities that's dealing with mental health, it's every community organisation that is dealing with mental health. And we can't take no more on because we're working with everything else. So securing those services, because we're not getting it through the trusts. I'm not blaming the nurses or the doctors or anything. The systems need wiped out, and 3.3 billion doesn't do it for me.
I don't know why I was picked. But anyway, I think that it's important that people understand that they have the power. I think that's something that's very essential, and we need to learn to know how to use that power. We also need to learn how power works so that we can design our tactics against power, because it's power at the end of the day that is the cause of allegedly no funding, allegedly no proper psychological service, mental health services, and not to leave out the money that's made from it through pharmaceuticals et al. I mean, that's an important thing. And what people need to do is question the answers as opposed to be answering the questions. I mean, it's a very important thing that people need to get into their head. And if we set up and build this new script right across the country, north and south, in fact, and build it on a basis of participatory practice and humanity and caring, I think the power in the system won't be able to defeat us. And I think that we'll have victory written all over us. Thank you.
Hello? Oh, well, keep it short, I swear. No, I genuinely want to say, thank you so much, because I think you touched on it, Mari. I suppose we're all, majority of us in here are either, or all three, we've lived experience, we're working in the system as well, and we're out campaigning and being activists and stuff. And I think it is that thing of, how do we look after ourselves and that, because actually a woman I'm working with said the other day, she was like, I do not want to retell my story in an environment that is not safe. And as an activist, you are constantly you're opening yourself up, and you're in an environment that isn't safe, because this, I've lived in other countries and I've found them way more safe to talk about trauma and mental health, which really shocks me, because I feel like we experience it, on a very complex level because of the history of the conflict and stuff here. So I suppose it's I'm just curious about how do we think about that, and how do we look after ourselves as activists in that. And I just wonder, the creativity has been a massive thing, but recently I've been thinking we're retelling our stories too, which is reliving our trauma. But how do we look after ourselves and other activists in that, in this kind of environment that's quite shaming, stigmatizing? How do we look after ourselves and each other in this?
We won't get to time we've left, we won't get to cover everything at this stage comprehensively, but just if you want to
Yes. Well, yeah, I think, I spoke into that vacuum that is currently in existence. And I suppose what I have witnessed, particularly over the last couple of years, we've been trying to bring mixed groups of practitioners and people who are working in the field in some shape or form, particularly with those community who are here seeking safety from other conflicts around the world as well as. And it's so important that people, the workforce, understand what is happening within them as a result of the pressure that the institutions, that the structures and the systems are actually placing upon us. And particularly, it's not just the community and voluntary sector. We have had nurses, we have had midwives, we have had social workers come up, and they are burnt out too, absolutely burnt out. In fact, they're carrying vicarious trauma. And that they have heard, they have been pressurised so much, and that's very dangerous. And I suppose really, if we can start to get awareness, understanding for people, taking them out, we kind of have been trying to take them out for a couple of days. I'm not saying it's brilliant, but it was all that we could manage with the tiny bit of money that was made available. But actually bringing a mixed group of professionals from different places, offering holistic care, starting to collaborate, starting to join together in solidarity and bring together their wisdom and expertise. Because I think there's no badge of honour for being burnt out. I really see it in Northern Ireland over the years. The more, there's this real badge of honour that, if you're exhausted and burnt out, that you're doing a really good job. Absolutely no. We need to change that mindset. We need to start really honouring and looking after ourselves. I myself worked in Women's Aid for many years. Amazing organisation, but I left exhausted and burnt out. And I had to go seeking other ways of being able to resource myself. And it wasn't medication, it wasn't talking therapy, because I knew what was wrong with me. I knew what was happening within me. And it's learning how, as you talked about, Lisa, what works for us as individual, although it's a collective experience, we have to connect with who we are again, what works for us, what do we like, how do we move, what sensory things that do we involve. Art is incredible, for me anyway. And that's when I started silversmithing, was because I had vicarious trauma, just the smell of the metal, getting out once a week away from all of the pain and suffering that kind of I was exposed to. So I think we need to start really putting pressure on institutions, on whatever system we have or haven't got, about putting in staff well-being and really starting to think this is critical, because we are also burning out alongside within those that we're alongside. So, yeah.
Really timely reminder, a really big question for all of us.
Okay, just briefly, Mags, I think how we organise ourselves as activists is really important. And we do have a bit of, how many hours did you work last week? I'm sure that was nothing compared to me. And the other one that come up with a lot is, sure, there's always somebody worse off than yourself. So you can't actually complain a lot because you're saying, what are you doing? Sure, there's that person over there who's working for nothing. But so we need to pay, rather than just always doing, there is an instinct, is once we have a sensation, is that we move very quickly to action, and it's sometimes that may be around the sort of things that, Denise and Lisa are talking about, is a level of fear, and that to try and stop that, we go and we act and organise something else. Whereas what we need to do is take time, and this has been a struggle for me over 35 years, is to persuade organisations that it is not a waste of time to take a day every 6 months where you sit down and you don't talk about what the activity, but the impact that the work is having on you and how you can support each other. So it is a collective sport. I hate the term self-care. It's as though you can care for yourself, and you can't really, we are pack animals. We need the collective support of other people to survive.
Great. Thank you.
So I'm just going to finish up because we're all getting restless and we've been talking for an awful long time, and it is a Friday afternoon, so we're coming to the end. Just to say on that point about self-care, do you know that it is a biological imperative? Co-regulation is a biological imperative. We need people for the rest of our lives in terms of this, and that's one of the problems, is everything, perhaps it's all about me that I got to do this. We need to do it together, and sometimes we need teaching each other. It's in relationship we learn these things. So in terms of what we are doing, right, with the new script, we've got three kind of, I don't like the word work stream because that sounds like services, but we've got three areas. So the one is accountability, where activists who want to be involved in that are looking at holding government to account. The RQIA was just found in a judicial review for not inspecting community mental health services for 14 years, and there has been no hullabaloo about that and no apology to those of us who use those community mental health services. Accountability work stream is that's one area. There's the antidepressant, Suicide rates are 3 times higher in most deprived areas. Prescribing rates, mental health is a social, political, and inequality issue. It's not a chemical imbalance in our brain. And that's part of what the activism is as well. In our alternatives, it's also about saying this burnout of constantly coming up against these power structures, especially when trauma and adversity, because trauma can be another word that can exclude people. You know, if I haven't had the big T's, then that hasn't happened to me. We all as human beings experience that wounding. So this is about all of us, our humanity. So in that, we're doing the evidence-based, the arts, the moving, because we know that you think back to sitting around a fire and telling stories, singing together, moving together. It's rhythm. It moves and shifts that stuff that's held in us, and it's about the together. It's that joining. It's action. Then we've got and part of that is these education workshops, because it's actually, I believed I was mentally ill that's who I was. That was my identity. A learned helplessness in a system that said I was wrong and disordered. I have no stigma issues. I can talk about, you know, it's not that having a mental illness is, but actually that wasn't what was going on for me. So it's about having a different conversation as well. And then on the other side, we've developed MAGs, and you were leading on that, about collective care. Because the thing is that if we're not, trauma-informed is about values and the principles. It's about autonomy, choice, voice. It's about options. It's about rights. Our rights to good mental health and well-being, our right to be able to put food on the table for our kids. You know, so those values need to be happening in the person, between Sarah and I, between each other. Because if we're not doing it for ourselves, how can we be doing it for everybody else? Part of that nurturing and that holding hope and that energy to keep going is about that care, reminding each other it's okay, permission. And there's a beautiful quote we used at our last reflection workshop talking about a choir, and a choir that sings really beautifully. When you lose your breath, you can take that step back, you know, and that's what we do in the campaign. It's about options and choices, you know, to come in and to hold each other, to do that collectively, that care. So if you want to get involved, you can sign. If you're not already signed up to our mailing list, you can sign up to that. We can always have a conversation to meet with you as well. If you want to come along to any of the activist meetings, you're very welcome. Just get in touch and we can let you know when that is. The website we'll be building, it's about sharing as well. This is a social movement. It's not a service. It's not a crisis service. It's not a counseling service. People can come and go. You don't have to give up anything to be part of this as well. This is about everybody. So do contact us to hear more. We're doing our first show privately of Desperate Monologues with Damien Gorman on Thursday, and this will be a road show, so do look out. So thank you, and thank you so much to Owen and Fergal and everybody.
Thanks very much, Lisa. Just on the way out, there's a table there. If you haven't put your email address on it, if you want to be on our mailing list, that's the way you'll be able to stay in touch with what's happening. Go on our website, take the leaflet home off the table, and go on our website and have a look at what's there. You can share your own new script on our website. There's a button you just click and share your own new script. But before everybody leaves, there's something that Denise is going to do with us. And before I hand over to Denise, just to say a huge thank you, first of all, to Denise Bradley, Mary Quiery, and Lisa Morrison, who've given us so much today. Thank you so much. And also, I want to say, Corrymeela for Glór agus don Cultureland for being here in the Cultureland and for looking after us so well today. It's just a beautiful space to be in. And also, we're delighted to be continuing to work collaboratively with Glór, who are just an amazing community-based grassroots organisation whose values just fit so well with our own values. So our next public event on the Curious Minds is on the 6th of March. Sign up to our mailing list. Wednesday, the 6th of March at lunchtime, Professor John Reid, who is internationally known for his work in doing exactly what we're talking about here today, trying to challenge the medical model of distress and develop and work with people to create. He's also done a lot of work around ECT, and Lisa has been working directly with him. So that will be one not to miss. He's the most accomplished and learned guy who is the most humble person and just speaks very directly. So definitely worth getting along to him. So Corrymeela, and thank you to Marty as well for all the tech support. So I'm going to hand over to Denise, and if you just all stay where you are.